And good day. My name is Jason McDowell, Chief System Integration Officer of the Energy System Integration Group and Senior Director for GE Vernova's Consulting Services. It's nice to see everyone here today as we head into the end of the year. And let me welcome you to our eSIG monthly webinar for November. For those of you not familiar with eSIG, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization providing our members with objective information, resources, networking opportunities in support of the energy transition. We do this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working group and task force activities, and producing technical resource material. eSIG also serves in a leadership capacity with the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or the GPST, whose mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and speed. eSIG leads Pillar 1 of the 5 pillars, which deals with the research agenda and the system operators. We've had a busy last couple of months with our task force meetings and webinars. We just finished a great eSIG fall technical workshop in San Diego at the end of October. And we're already preparing for our spring technical workshop in Tucson in March. Our workshops and monthly webinars are open to everyone, so please feel free to register at any time on the eSIG website. If you're new to eSIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Our eSIG membership will give you opportunity to participate actively in all of our working groups and task forces, and you can find us on the web at www.esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Okay, just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. And for the Q&A, we're going to be using the Slido platform. So to ask your questions, please go to slido.com and enter code ESIG28, that's ESIG28, as the event code. The instructions are also at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a thumbs up button next to the questions to allow you to cast a vote and prioritize the questions you'd like to have answered first. We plan to save 10 minutes or so for Q&A at the end, and we'll wrap it up at the top of the hour. An email with a link will be provided once the video file has been posted, and we also plan to provide short responses to any unanswered questions after the webinar. So please don't be afraid to ask your questions through Slido. Okay, I'd like to introduce the speakers now. Today's topic is going to be on DER communication and data management, from interoperability to impacts. This is a topic of increasing interest and importance, with forecasts from some sources that DER could make up as much of 50% of our future generation resource. And here to talk about it today is Sean Morash, a principal at Telos Energy, and Snyder, Director of Grid Technology Consulting at EnerNex. Sean has experience across a broad range of topics, including power system modeling, transmission and distribution planning, sensing and measurement, and distribution automation. Aaron's bag of tricks includes metering, AMI, smart grid, and grid modernization projects, specializing in testing and metering. He participates in standards development activities at the national and international levels. Both Telos and EnerNex are valued members of eSIG, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Sean and Aaron here today. Today's webinar will address DER interoperability and data management, increasing standardization of DER information, and will outline the modeling and operational benefits of such an approach. It will include a discussion of how cohesive data architecture supports both FERC Order 2222, implementation, and asset management. I greatly value the contributions of Telos and EnerNex to eSIG and in the industry, and we look forward to hearing what Sean and Aaron have to say today. Just a short reminder, once again, to use Slido at slido.com with the event code ESIG28 to ask your questions. And without further ado, it's a great pleasure to welcome Aaron and Sean to give the webinar today. Sean and Aaron, please take it away.
Thanks, Jason. I had a little spiel prepared to talk to this slide, but I think you did a great job with it. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to the first one. And Aaron's going to introduce a little bit of EnerNex.
Sean. For those of you that don't know EnerNex, we're a consulting firm based in Knoxville, Tennessee. We're part of the broader Chesi group that's based in Milan, Italy. We do projects with most of the stakeholders in the industry.
Sean and Aaron, it looks like, at least for me, we can't hear you.
I don't know, Sean. I heard Sean. Can you not hear me?
You guys are okay.
Yeah, Aaron, you're good.
Okay. Thank you. So we work with most of the stakeholders in the industry, whether you're a vendor or electric utility or another consulting firm. We do work both at the strategic level down to the more pragmatic testing and through to power system simulations. We have been a longtime member of ESIG back through its multiple different names and are known in with different stakeholders for different things. We also, the Chesi Group recently bought Kima Labs, which you might recognize as, having the largest independent high power, high voltage lab in US and Europe. So a pretty broad group, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, I'll do a quick intro on Telos. I find that folks either know us for our kind of dynamics and inverter controls work or our resource adequacy work. But this slide actually existed before I came on board about a year ago, and it included DER planning and storage specification. And so we've got a kind of a range of analytics and engineering offerings that we can give for a kind of more reliable and efficient power grid. With that, we've got some background. Thank you to ESIG as well. I meant to say this for the opportunity to present here and to kind of share some thoughts on this topic. We're going to cover kind of DER landscape. We've all seen some exponential growth graphs in our day, and sometimes we get numb to those. So kind of checking in, making sure we're all thinking about DER kind of not as where we're at on those. We hopeful. Aaron's going to chat through kind of the standards landscape, particularly with respect to DER across kind of communication, data, interoperability, and then kind of touch on some of the benefits of making sure there's a coordinated approach there. Speaking of benefits, that's kind of what I'm going to wrap us up with. Not just terms where we think about kind of operational benefits, but DER and planning, and kind of what that might mean if we plan on DER as opposed to maybe around DER or despite DER. Kind of think through what some of those topics might be. So I learned a new word last week, Wunderkammer. It's German for wonder chamber. If nothing else in this webinar, you might take home this topic. I'm going to revisit it at the end. We can figure out kind of why maybe I introduced this concept. Wunderkammer was a room with private collection of rare natural history items. It's corals, mandrakes, weird antlers, narwhal tusks. Cool place, something I might want to go to. But this was a kind of the precursor to natural history museums. So we're going to revisit this at the end, and hopefully you'll learn more than just this one new word throughout the course of this webinar. Challenge you to kind of come up with your own concept of why we might be thinking about such a weird kind of private collection of rare materials. I promised to talk about DER kind of adoption trends. I've been leading over the last year a grid planning for vehicle electrification task force. We are just about to publish a white paper that covers kind of a variety of topics on that, on vehicle electrification. The first thing it covers is kind of the scope and the forecasting and how we can do that better, and how, what some of that is telling us. But there was a recent report out of National Renewable Energy Lab that showed, as we think about vehicle electrification through the end of the decade, we're thinking about 30 million electric vehicles. You can do some back of the envelope math on that and recognize it comes to something like 1,000 gigawatt hours of latent storage capacity in those vehicles. So this is a a big change. If you're skeptical of forecasts, like I tend to be, we can look towards the historical record and recognize some really significant growth in EVs over the last decade. I've got a chart from Tesla here that shows their vehicles delivered over the decade and kind of that exponential growth there. And I think we're increasingly entering the period where this is not just exponential growth on going from 1 to 2 to 4. Increasingly, we're getting into the millions, where this is becoming significant. Right, we've passed the 5% mark of new vehicles sold being electric vehicles. I think this year it's on pace for something like 9% of new vehicle sales are going to be EVs. And so historically, that's when kind of the S shape takes off. I've got a whole webinar on this scheduled with ESIG on the 19th. I think an announcement's going out later this week. But and we'll cover a lot more topics here, but I've got lots of things to say. I've also been leading the Building Electrification Task Force. So when you think about DERs in the context of building electrification, there's increasingly significant, kind of demand response capability in there, but also what that means for our ability to, what that does for our load shapes. So we can look at forecasts again, and we see, hey, winter peaks become, driven a lot by building electrification and the kind of heating demand that might come with that. Think through what that looks like from an event standpoint, where, hey, in the winter, our events tend to last longer, and so maybe our kind of grid planning and our DER programs need to take into consideration that these long winter events lead to different grid needs than our kind of hot summer afternoons that quickly turn into more mild overnight hours. But I'm here to say that, it's not just forecast. There's some interesting work looking at the Texas power system and how that has become more temperature sensitive over time, right? If we look at the early 2000s, we think about our winter storms. Those looked a lot more mild, given facing the same temperatures than our kind of more recent events, facing kind of more extreme temperatures. So how to think through kind of, hey, we're not just facing kind of a forecasted building electrification, that in a lot of ways it's already here, it's already affecting our load shapes and our temperature sensitivity. Can't talk about DER without talking about solar and storage. There was a recent report out of the Solar Energy Association, the kind of solar markets insight for 2022. I like two of their charts. One showed kind of historical and forecasted photovoltaic share of capacity based on a couple of different factors. The big way to read that chart is, hey, over historically and then forecasted in the future, something like 30 to 40% of the PV that gets out there is non-utility scale, right? This is residential or maybe it's community level solar. Similarly, that residential and community level solar is increasingly getting solar and storage. So we've had to deal with intermittency of kind of rooftop solar, but increasingly incentives are being aligned to put storage out there with it. So we're gonna have a lot of storage with our EVs, but also kind of dedicated residential and commercial applications, not so much kind of utility owned necessarily. So the last thought here on kind of DER adoption, DER landscape, maybe we're not convinced by adoption trends and market forces. Maybe there's some policy that pushes us in a certain direction. This is FERC Order 2222. It was issued in late 2020. The main goal here is to better enable DERs to participate in electric markets. DER, basically anything, it can't be bigger than the markets have to adopt a minimum size requirement no larger than 100 kW. So really small DERs can start participating in wholesale markets. That's cool. The other thing that's cool here is the kind of DER, I'm going to say distribution utility coordination across the DSO and ISO interface. So that can show up across planning, right? So can a DER physically participate in the market? But then also kind of on day of, hey, if the ISO or RTO wants to dispatch in a certain way, the distribution operator can kind of say, hey, that's going to cause a reliability risk on the distribution system, and cause a challenge. So on the surface, that sounds pretty easy, right? We can kind of, hey, that's not going to work. That's a reliability challenge. In practice, when we talk about a variety of stakeholders, large organizations, but also their third-party vendors, also their customers, it's a hard thing to start coordinating and start communicating about. And so that's where standards can come in and be helpful to make sure everybody is kind of speaking the same language. So with that, Aaron, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us a little bit more of kind of the practicalities of implementing this stuff.
Thank you, Sean. So I want you, those of you participating, to look at the figure on the right-hand side, and you'll notice there's some connectivity that's implied and a couple of layers. So that concept is important as we think about what I'm going to be talking about, which is the standards landscape. What are some of those enabling communication standards? How do we get from the field to the back office with information across what interfaces, and then a brief discussion of the data benefits that are involved in this whole, well, I'll call it a domain for today. So that layers concept is very important because it allows us to create well-defined points of integration and interoperability. And what we mean by that is we all have different abilities and different interests in working in this industry. Some of you might like to design connectors for great equipment. Some of you might like to design, network interface cards. Some of you might like to design software. Well, those all touch on different layers of that integrated system. And what we often do is relate our work to this Open Systems Interconnect layer model. There are 7 of them. And each layer allows us to kind of decompose the very complex problem into smaller manageable parts that then experts can work within their interest and domain to create commonality, standards, communications, protocols, information exchange that we can all benefit from. So most likely, if you've worked in networking or electrical engineering, you've seen this before. But for those of you that haven't, this model is very helpful for designing these kinds of systems and interactions for all the stakeholders to understand their role, and to describe their needs across these interfaces. There's a poster I used to I still have. It used to be on my wall. I could still put it on my wall. I just have lost a little bit of space. And it kind of it used the OSI model against some very common networking technologies or things that people would know about. So most of us have probably heard of Ethernet and Wi-Fi, and those are physical layer standards, and that's the raw connectivity of things to each other. Built upon that, then we need other technology to exchange information. That's just, wires and copper and a connector, or, the radio interface. And most of us are probably familiar with the TCP/IP networking collection that we use every day. In fact, we're using right now for this webinar. At the very top would be the application layer, which is the WebEx application running on top of all the networking technology. And for me, I'm using Ethernet connecting to my router to the internet. If you look over to the right-hand side, you'll see voice over IP. It's another collection of technologies that allows us to do telephone calls and might be companion to what we're doing with the core networking here on this webinar. And then if you're trying to maintain some semblance of privacy, or for other reasons you're using public cafe internet, or you want to add a layer of protection, you might be using a virtual private networking technology, as you can see on the right hand side, covers some of the middle between the physical connectivity and that application on the top, which if you've ever run one of those tools, you know, is another application you run that creates a little network for you. On the very far right-hand side, which you'll be able to see probably much better when you get the slides on your own computer, is the Apple networking technology stack. And you'll see this a little bit different. You'll see there's a lot fewer boxes. And that gets us to a difference between, and I'm not saying that's not the case, technologies that can minimize, we'll say, combinations or options with technologies that are completely open. So Apple created a very streamlined and high performance networking capability that was built into their computing technology, has fewer options. It's not as selectable for other things. And then their commonality to the rest of us would be the Ethernet, the data link layer, or the application layer, depending on how we might want to connect. Whereas, you can also think of it as your Wi-Fi used to be where you had to have your equipment from the same vendor for it to work. I can remember a few decades back trying to get my home networking to work, and if you didn't have the same vendor for the router and the interface card and anything else, it probably wasn't going to connect. And there are other technologies that kind of suffered the same problem initially. Now we have this concept of alliances that do a lot of interoperability testing and create interoperability profiles and some other elements that allow us to experience that plug and play aspect that we enjoy for the convenience, while still bringing in security, high performance, and other things that are useful. So you'll note that a lot of times there are things that are competing and complementary, or that there are choices to make along the route for the different things we're trying to do in the connectivity problem. At the application layer, this DER and demand response, which is a subset, are part of the ecosystem in the distribution network, generally speaking. Not necessarily the case, because distributed just means it's somewhere in the grid, so it can connect to the transmission system depending on the rules. But generally speaking, there's a collection of protocols that are used for those types of devices. You'll see on the left-hand side that for distribution automation and for what we do with DER and DR, they're pretty much the same, because it depends on the viewpoint of how you view that asset. So if I view the asset as a controllable grid element, then I use a protocol that's very useful for that. If I want to think of it as a market participant, I might want to use a different language at a certain layer to create the interaction, and then use lower level protocols for the core connectivity. You'll see one commonality in all these application layer protocols is we're driving towards that core TCP/IP, or what we think of as just regular computing technology interconnectivity protocols, because that is kind of the clear winner for this. We don't need to have a lot of competition in the middle when that technology works. We can then add security, we can add the other elements we need at different points in that technology stack to accomplish our goals. So, a key takeaway from what we're talking about is the protocol we're thinking about may only exist in one place, at a particular layer or access point of the communications network, and there'll be some other stuff in the middle to get to the end device, just like you experience every day with, if you have a personal cell phone or your laptop or computer you're using for this webinar. Oops, not page down, the arrow. If you're familiar with this domain, you know there's a standard written by the IEEE called 1547, and one of the recent revisions, they created a list of protocols, one of which is required to be supported. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but you'll note in the middle of that column that the commonality is that core computing technology, TCP/IP. So you can add security, VPN, other things on top of it or around it, but your core technology is going to be supporting that aspect of that. And then the physical layer, you'll note, is pretty much Ethernet, just like we're used to for regular computing technology, or there's still a serial physical layer that's possible. And what this represents, it should be noted that when you think of that stack concept, we don't need all of them all the time. Some of the protocols can compress or abstract the actual layers into a smaller number of layers to accomplish the goals. So you'll see that on the left-hand side, that shrinking gets you down to what we're seeing on the right-hand side. You can abstract it down to a smaller number to get things to work, without having to think about building something specific for each particular layer. So in this case, we would have the application layer protocol. There's some core networking in the middle, the TCP/IP, and then the physical network interface. So we've taken all 7 and abstracted it down to 3 to develop interoperability and other elements that we want with this particular standard implementation. Now you're going to say, well, that's great, I should use that everywhere. It's helpful to remember a lot of times that as we talk about layers in the protocol, we can also talk about layers or really domains inside the industry. So that protocol requirement for that standard is really just between the DER and the next thing upstream, or if you're thinking about it from the utility, the last thing downstream before the DER. So everything in gray on your screen is not required and is out of scope for that particular requirement. If you have some other means to talk or measure or interact with a device in the field, that is out of scope. You are just required to support that for one external interface so that this equipment can be installed to connect you to the broader world. Again, this is going to come into play in a few minutes as we discuss what that means pragmatically. Moving from the landscape on to the enabling communication standards, the first question you're going to say is, well, you only mentioned one, and then you mentioned a few, and then, well, maybe there's even more. And if you've been dealing with standards and protocols, you know the answer to that is there's always another one out there. Don't worry. But it is it can be seen as bad. But the real thing to think about is ask yourself some questions about what you're trying to do, and then you can narrow the scope of what you're trying to accomplish down a bit, and then start selecting technology that's more likely to apply. So you saw in the case of IEEE 1547, there are a lot of standards they could have picked. They really picked, that collection from the best that we use today for that domain. Now, if you're going to do this on your own at home, you need to start thinking about the complexity by asking the questions, who's involved? We call those actors or stakeholders. How many of them are there? Is it really just 2 people? Is it a few people? Are you talking one to many? Are you doing a bilateral exchange? Is everyone needing talking to everyone all the time? But what actors are involved? And an actor can be a software system, it can be a human being, it can be a device. So again, it's who's involved in the conversation. Then we have to think about what is it we're trying to exchange. Are we just trying to learn something? So I just want some data. Do I want that data to have to be telling me to do something, so it's actionable information, or do I want some actual intelligence or awareness to be part of that exchange? Meaning, data might be 37. Well, 37 what? Well, I know that it's volts, so 37 volts. That's great. Actual information might be 37 volts plus, hey, that's low. And then intelligence awareness might be, I've already done something with that. I'm basically just telling you it was low. By the way, we've already triggered our low voltage, protection. So, what's being done there? And then ultimately, as I just gave an example, is that a monitoring issue? Are you trying to do control? Are you operating the equipment? Is there some sort of technical thing you're trying to look at? Or is this a business exchange where we're just trying to exchange information about a contract or core capabilities or bidding into a market? So another view of this is here's a collection of actors for DER. And so you ask how many actors are involved. Well, this is actually probably soon to be a representative example of a fair amount of utilities. So in green, you're going to see some customer-owned DER. There's probably going to be permitted aggregators, depending on the size of the customer DER that wants to play in the market. There's probably going to be merchant DER that's permissible, meaning people that can bid independent, DER into the network. Utilities like to own and operate their own assets, and so there's certainly going to be some utility DER. And this is just a market business view. So this is a simplified view. Folks need to exchange information. Probably is going to flow, if it's utility or customer, through the utility. Probably if it's an aggregator, it might go direct to the market, or the merchant direct to the market. It really just depends on, what part of the world you're in, what part of the US you might be in. But at this level, already we can start thinking about what data or information might need to be exchanged. Is it size, availability, time, ramp rate? What do I need to bid into the market? So at this level, really what we're collecting is, what do we need to know to bid DER into this market for each one of these particular individual actors that have energy that can be offered to help the system. So that's one example. We get to a technical view. I might like to manage this asset somehow. Now, I'm not going to define what the somehow means. I might be the owner of the asset. I might be the maintenance firm. I might be the operator. But from the technical standpoint, I need to know what this asset is. What does it represent? And so this is an example, if you've heard about the common information model that's developed, that's owned, or I guess we'll call it owned by the UCA International Users Group and developed also and published as an IEC standard, contains views of grid assets, grid things in a commonly defined fashion. So this is one example of the technical view of an asset. And I kind of exploded, it's called asset measurement, but measurement is a bit of, not quite a red herring, but a little bit different about what you're thinking about. This isn't voltage and current. This is, what's involved. So I pulled out the asset object. So was there an acceptance test? What's the baseline condition? There's some other things about information about this asset that I need to know. It might be static, it might be dynamic, but it also might have a procedure related to it. It might be an inspection, and then there's a diagnosis version of it. There's a maintenance version, there's a test version. So from a technical standpoint, we view the asset a different way than we do from the business standpoint. So you'll notice none of this is related to bidding it into a market, most likely. Purchase price is probably not that helpful. Serial number, maybe, but I mean, not really what we're thinking about. So the view of this DER is different for this particular technical, we'll call it asset management viewpoint versus the market viewpoint. Moving on to the operational view, you're the operator of the network. You need to know how this asset is performing in real time. You need to know how it's configured. You need to know if you push a button to enable it or disable it, that it's going to happen. So here's another view using also the common information model as an example, where we might have the definition of its function. Is it frequency watt curve? Is it ramp rate? Is it reactive power dispatch? Is it volt var? Or what are the functions that are possible I can select from? It might go, there is a connection to the concept of metering or measurement, or, using those pieces of information. And then what are the monitorable parameters of the DER? Again, this is a common information model view. This is an application-to-application view. This is not even asset to, intervening DERM system. This is, let's say, between the DERMs and another enterprise system. So again, from the operational standpoint, I'm using my ADMS to operate or send signals to the DERMs to do something with an asset. Here's an example of the information that can be that is defined in a common way to be exchanged or used in that conversation. And then when you get this and you zoom in, or if you have access to which is publicly available, the SIM model, you can dig in and see a bunch of other things that are part of this overview of a DER asset. Finally, if we think about it from the field standpoint and, as a block diagram, we have the DER assets, we're calling them with the customer, but the customer could be the utility, use a particular set of protocols to talk to the DERMS. They're measured by meters. Generally, the meters don't use those protocols at all. So the utility is going to meter that location or that performance a different way. The asset service provider, it might be the manufacturer, it might be another party, is going to get information from that asset a different way as well. And sometimes that might even be proprietary, but using the customer supplied internet or whatnot. So already different purposes and different uses and needs for this DER, even at the core protocol, vary. So in the field, it might be required to use one of these three. The field of the enterprise might be something else. Enterprise to enterprise, or software application to software application, or you to another stakeholder, you might use a common information model. And again, you might also have a proprietary link because you own the asset. It's your trademark, it's your brand, and you've got permission to monitor that, to tell people, hey, you need to not change the tires, but you've got an issue. It's time to do something with your DER from a performance standpoint that I, as the manufacturer, want you to do, or it's a service interval or something else. So getting from the field to the back office, this is, again, an enterprise to enterprise application example, but what information is part of that conversation? And the reason why I'm talking about from back office to back office is, if you think you want something or want to know something about the device, your communications has to account for that. So it does no good to say, I need to exchange ramp rate control for my DER between the ADMS and the DERMS without being able to know or control, monitor, measure, or change that at the device level and have no way to talk to it. Because you're certainly not going to do that between the ADMS and the DERMS. Neither one of those, in this conversation example, are going to be sending that down yet. So that's part of the conversation. It has to get from the field to the back office, but if you need it in the back office, you have to be able to get it from the field. So there's a lot of communications layers and protocol layers to get that to work. One last example, as we think about it again, I kind of touched on it. If you have a smart inverter, those inverters can do a lot. And on the one hand, you're required to put an interface according to 1547, but on the other hand, as I mentioned, the manufacturer may have connectivity to that to monitor it for warranty or maintenance purposes, or another third party, maybe through the customer internet. So what does that inverter provide? By what standards and protocols lets me know what I need to build to take advantage of that. Then most likely these devices are being metered somehow for the utility purposes. And again, those meters can provide a lot of information, a surprising amount of information. And so if you want that, you have to think about that up front. Can you get it from the device, or are you going to be calculating that from other parameters that you can directly measure? So what I was hoping to demonstrate to you is that this data and communications really depends on your perspective, your context, or your point of view. So if you're a modeler, you might need to know certain pieces of information about the DER. If you're interested in doing health monitoring and providing service, you need to know different information about that DER. If you are operating the asset, again, it's a different collection of information. Some of it might overlap, but you have different data needs, different information needs. If you're doing a different kind of modeling and dispatching for service or outage management or anything else, you have a different collection of data needs. And all of these will help scope out what protocol, what standards you need to accomplish that, and what connectivity. And then the final thought to leave with you is this also depends on the granularity of the data, meaning how discrete it is. Do you need a measurement every do you want a measurement of something every 15 minutes, every minute, every second, every hour? How often do you need to exchange that? So sure, I want the measurement every 15 minutes, but it's okay if I get it once a day. That's an example for interval metering for billing. What is the volume of that data? I want to know everything about every asset. No, that's probably not a good idea because you probably can't actually use all of that. So you have to think about defining that data in a way that makes it usable. And then how dynamic is that data? Is it a one-time snapshot? So likely the geospatial, the DER is not going to move around that much unless it's a car. Or is it relatively static and we can get by with, once a year, once every couple of year audit or refresh of that data. Finally, some of the benefits to wrap it up. We think about interoperability. We want to make it friendly, user-friendly for everybody, and the user can be any particular stakeholder you think about. We need to understand the standards, what layer we're thinking about, what's the data model, who's going to be using that, how we would connect it. And then if we're modeling, what type of model we're thinking about and how we might use that model. So all of those, if it's done in a standardized fashion and an interoperable fashion using well-known interfaces, the well-known profiles of the standards, enables us to do our job much more efficiently. So I'll hand this back off to Sean.
Thank you, Aaron. If you could slide the ball back over to me, that'd be great too. I liked the slide you had at the end there. I actually liked it better than the next slide that I'm going to use.
How do I switch it to you? I'm sorry.
Start my video too. I think it was successfully done.
Excellent.
Yeah. Looks dark in here suddenly. There it goes. Okay. Yeah, so one of the things I want to accomplish here is Aaron walked us through a lot of kind of data, communication layers, making sure we're talking through different things, kind of he unboxed a whole world, I think, for some folks who maybe don't think about that stuff every day. And it can be a little overwhelming and maybe a little numbing. And part of it can be, hey, we're trying to do a DERMS, we're trying to manage DER in kind of an operational context. And that can require a lot of data exchanges across a lot of different players to make it happen. But I think there's more than just, there's value in doing that beyond just kind of quote unquote operating the grid, right? I think there was a comment in Slido about, hey, in South Australia, we're 99% DER sometimes. So just operating the grid with DER is a big deal there. But I think we also have to figure out how we can use DER data and kind of what this management is doing in kind of the planning context. We're also concerned about customer services, metering, billing, kind of creating a grid that works for everybody, and not just worried about on a kind of a real-time operational basis. I'm going to focus in on resource adequacy and distribution planning for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up to some questions. So DER in kind of resource adequacy or in bulk system planning, I think about this as a little bit of a kind of the early customer service folks designed some demand response and DER programs, handed them over to some operations folks and said, here you go. Operations folks looked at that and was like, man, I really wanted perfume, not an elephant. And the reason for that is, hey, there's, these designs were done with kind of, hey, you only have a certain amount of events per year where the customer can be interrupted, and operators don't know, how to save those or go ahead and implement them. Similarly, planners don't know if we can use, how to model those discreetly without getting too much foresight and too much optimization included in our kind of resource adequacy models. Similarly, these early, demand response programs or even today's, they all have to have kind of customer opt-out capability where, hey, the the customer it's Thanksgiving or it's Christmas time and or some other holiday, and now is really not the time for demand response, or for you to be messing with my EV charger. And so that creates a little bit of discontinuity, right? The operators and planners don't know how much they can rely on these things. There's other challenges with kind of energy losses, snapback effects we can get into, but the last one here is around, hey, we've designed some programs to manage peak loading. Well, as that shifts over time, as we get more building electrification, as kind of EVs participate in those kind of events, we've got a changing kind of grid need. And are our programs and our incentives set up to adapt to changing grid needs? So there's a whole suite of kind of challenges with DER and DR in kind of resource adequacy or in bulk system planning, and I've seen it represented in a few different ways. One, kind of, hey, a fixed model. You run your kind of year-long analysis, and you say, hey, this is when I would dispatch them. Now that's how I'm going to dispatch them kind of regardless of grid conditions. You can do some sort of performance factor approach where you say, hey, I've called on you in the past, only about 80% has showed up. So instead of being a 100 megawatt resource, you're now going to be considered an 80 megawatt resource. You can be a little more nuanced than that. You can kind of look at bit history and create more sophisticated kind of representations of that same thing. Where we say, hey, at 5 p.m. you've never gone above 50 megawatts. So yeah, while your nameplate is 100 megawatts, that's not realistically how that's going to be represented in a kind of hourly chronological simulation. Our last option, we can be unrestricted. We can kind of allow full optimization of DER at nameplate. I'm not here to say one's better than the other. I'm saying there are different options and that we need to make use of our existing data to make the best decision as a modeling and planning community to kind of represent things for a given jurisdiction, given DER kind of performance, both kind of historical, but also what we want in the future. I also want to touch on distribution planning. There was a really good paper recently out of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab that talked about the use of demand response in system planning. About half of the paper was on distribution. My take on some of this is that now is really not the best time to be talking non-wires alternatives. It's a tough spot in the hype cycle. It's kind of this trough of disillusionment. There was a lot of momentum about 5-10 years ago, and we have had a hard time making cases for non-wires alternatives given various kind of economic factors, but also uncertainties into the future. But I also think that kind of EV charging can change the urgency on some of this. As we think through using smart charging versus building new infrastructure and kind of the feasibility of both of those, I think it's kind of a new era of demand response and DER kind of at a highly granular level that it can be capable. The reason I mentioned that LBNL paper is they conclude that, hey, a lot of the current status on distribution system pricing is in the pilot phase, and that we need to get better at our planning with better tools, but also with data, right? We've got to get better data on our distribution system to be able to understand what we can do. So the last kind of concept here is around DER in wholesale markets. And there was a really good paper out of DOE, their VPP liftoff report, that talked about the different ISOs and what they're trying to do to implement kind of virtual power plants. Part of the challenge is, from my perspective, the kind of current DER process. We've kind of adapted some historical rules to make sure that DER can participate in markets. That leads to certain market performance, and then that's kind of embedded in our future planning performance, our planning parameters going forward. I think there's an opportunity to look at our kind of flip that a little bit and say, hey, we've got our early experience. We know what that data is telling us. We also know what our kind of future needs are going to be. And we can alter our kind of DER programs, but also our kind of legal and procedural language to alter, and get the market behavior that we want. We think about certain areas where DER are not performing kind of to the level of enrollment or technical capability that is available, and we got to ask ourselves why that might be. So, this concept around, how are we planning for DER, around DER, in spite of DER, or kind of planning to, really rely on it, I think is nuanced and starts with the data and kind of the coordination and control that we've talked through. This is some high level type stuff that boils back down to, well, how do we control it? How do we verify performance? And reliably orchestrate various distributed resources. Last thing, the new word I learned last week, Wunderkammer, our DER Wunderkammer. I think historically we've had kind of a rare collection of kind of one-off pet projects around, at least in North America, we've had one-off pet projects around distributed PV, around kind of command and control of EVs. We've got some pretty sophisticated water heater and thermostat programs out there, but I think there's opportunity for those to continue to grow, and to transition a little bit from kind of a collection of rare goods and a collection of rare kind of, we've got distributed resources in our kind of market mechanisms, to a the Natural History Museum equivalent of kind of coordinated grid architectures that make sense and that work and enable customer kind of options and participation in their power system. So with that, we saved a little bit of time for questions. Thanks, folks, for participating. And yeah, Jason, what do they got for us?
Sean and Aaron, thank you so much. Really great walk through the topic of both DER and demand response and communications. I certainly learned a lot. We have some questions starting to come through, so thank you for those that have asked and provided comments on Slido.com. Just a reminder, if you have questions, please go to Slido.com and enter event code ESIG28, ESIG28. Let's see, we have a couple of comments and a couple of questions to start out with. One comment came from Adrian from South Australia. He said, here in South Australia, distributed behind the meter PV is 99% of our fuel mix at times. The DER visibility forecasts and controls are certainly challenging. I think it's just, reinforcing a lot of the messages that you have been saying over the past hour. Russ had a question around the lines of, incentivizing load flexibility is critical. But when we're making only spotty progress in accessing this flexibility today, what do we see as some of the barriers to actually breaking down and moving forward with accomplishing everything that you talked about?
There's a lot of them in my mind. Barriers to load flexibility. So number one, I think we as power system people tend to make this stuff way too complicated. So one of the barriers is convincing folks to sign up using plain language. The other one is the measurement and verification. I think we kind of have to start there and say, are folks participating? Are we able to incentivize their participation in a way that we can measure it so that they can get paid and that we can see the real value? Other ones tend to be, the topic of our conversation here is around data coordination and kind of I think, are we able to measure it? And I think are multiple folks able to accomplish the same thing? So there's increasing kind of sensitivity to that.
Great. Thanks. Got another one coming in. It says, with DER market participation is for FERC Order 2222, what's the impact on the total DSO control room and on the distribution system?
What is the impact?
Yeah, what is the impact on the total DSO control on the distribution system? Any comments there?
Yeah, I mean, the coordination is the biggest impact. That's what I see is increasingly ISOs are going to be, messing around in the DSO's backyard. And so the DSO, historically has been able to do its own thing, be isolated, and have things act, kind of in a static manner. And increasingly, as the ISO is there fiddling around with bulk system needs, that's not going to necessarily be the case. And so kind of the biggest impact is suddenly having to pay attention to market prices, market mechanisms, different dispatch conditions.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. Anything to add, Aaron, on that
Not
topic?
for those, no.
Okay,
I'm
sure.
kind of glad Sean was answering those. That's not.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thanks,
I'm looking
Sean.
at a couple of the other ones in the window, thinking it's going to be me pretty soon.
Yeah. I'll Russ has another one on resource adequacy. He said resource adequacy historical performance appears to be a primary challenge for seeing the value of DER. What is your recommendation on how we should perform RA going forward? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think ESIG has published a few papers on how we should be performing RA going forward. The one thing I would say, I introduced those 4 kind of ways to model DER in an RA framework. I think the fixed capability is suboptimal. We shouldn't be doing fixed DER dispatch in an RA model.
Okay. Well, why don't we go down to a question, maybe Sean, that you'd like to answer? Maybe the one on slide 17. Is that one that you could answer?
That's mine, yeah.
Great. So let's move to that one. On slide 17, how does DER communicate with the utility, either through the meter? Is it the inverter? Is it both? Or is it something else? Will this change if the DER is an aggregation?
Well, I mean, the easy answer for the first half is yes, and the second answer is also yes. But the reality is that, again, it depends on the perspective of what the utility is trying to accomplish. So if they view it as a controllable grid asset, then they will want to use the protocol and the communications channel that likely they control or is very deterministic, so that if they need to have that asset do something or not do something, that they have a guaranteed secure pathway to achieve that. Most likely that's going to be using their, trusted distribution automation protocols, and then hitting that IEEE 1547 interface that they all have to provide and using that. If they're looking at the reconciliation of performance with respect to power or energy or reactive power, reactive energy, or something else, frequency, they need a meter of some sort. They may not communicate through that meter to the asset, but they're getting information about the asset through the meter, usually for the reconciliation of billing purposes. When it's an aggregation, it's not likely to change other than they'll have a defined path to the aggregator. So if you think about that slide 17, if they keep that picture in mind, the aggregator is somewhere in the middle. And the aggregator will have to have the interface to the assets using the defined protocol. And then upstream to the utility could be through, a secure internet portal. It could actually be through their, tried and true communications automation network. It really just depends on how they view that relationship from the business and technical standpoint. The measurement verification won't likely change. Everyone wants to be able to measure the actual performance and reconcile that with the expectation or with the, for lack of a better term, billing, program they're in. So the need for some type of meter, whatever we want to call a meter, will always be there.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for the answer. And thank you for all the questions. We're at the top of the hour. It looks like there's quite a few more questions that have floated in, which is fantastic. We'll work on compiling answers to those questions and getting those back to each one of you. But I really wanted to thank Sean and Aaron for this very timely webinar and for this very helpful and practical approach to the use of DER communication standards. As I mentioned earlier, an email will go out with a video file that has been posted, and we'll answer the questions as soon as we're able to get to them. We appreciate your engagement and look forward to seeing you again soon. Our 2023 webinar series will conclude with 3 additional webinars in December. The next one being on December 5th with Justin Sharp on expanded role of weather data in power system modeling. Further information on all of our webinars and meetings can be found at our website at www.esig.energy under events and in our newsletters and informational emails, all of which you're invited to attend. Sean and Aaron, thank you once again for this very timely and informative webinar, and thank you all for your interest. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And in the meantime, everyone, please take care, stay safe, and thanks for your participation. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.